Good afternoon. I want to apologize because my presentation will be in English as my Spanish is very limited. I want to start by thanking Dr. Carrera and the organizers for inviting me to be here. So, as has already been said, the number of older people are growing worldwide, and we know that, for example, in the United States, since January 1 of 2001, every day for the next 20 years, roughly about 10,000 Americans will be celebrating their birthday. Similarly, we know that in 2030, 1 of every 5 Americans, about 72 million people, will be an older adult. And that's not a phenomenon that is limited to United States or other developed countries. It is a global phenomenon, and in particular, for example, in Latin America, it is predicted that by the year 2030, more than 30% of people will be over the age of 65. So for the first time in the history of the world, there will be more people who are going to be over the age of 65 than under the age of 14. And this shift in population is going to have a significant socio-economic impact on all the countries around the world. The reason for it is that with aging comes, as has been already mentioned, many different diseases and disabilities, including cardiovascular disease, cancer, eye diseases, dementias, diabetes. And as you can see, the cost associated with these diseases is tremendous. So you can see the cost that is associated with treatment of Alzheimer's disease and dementias is going to be more than the revenues that is generated by some of the most productive companies in the world, for example, Walmart, Exxon, and so forth. And so you can see that this change in population is going to have a tremendous effect all around the world in terms of both the economies of the world as well as the impact in the society. Another thing to keep in mind is that, for example, while in 1930, for every person who retired, we had about a large number of young people who could work. But what we can predict is that in the 2030, there's going to be only 2.2 people working for every person that retires. So you can see that it's very important for the people that are getting older to be healthy and active because there are not very many people who can take care of them. So it's very important to work on not just increasing the lifespan, but the health span of the older people. In other words, what we need to be focusing on is to add life to years rather the other way around. And one of the first things we need to do that in terms of enhancing successful aging is to find how do we define successful aging. There are 2 concepts that I want to talk to you about successful aging, which has actually gone through a revolution over the age. When we first started to talk about successful aging, the thought was that aging process and aging-associated diseases are controlled mostly by genetic factors, and that the age-associated diseases were separate from the aging process itself. Now, we have come a long way from that definition, and what we understand today is that genetics actually, as we get older, plays a less important role in terms of controlling the diseases and also controlling the aging process. Only about 25% of the diseases are explained by genetic factor, and that many of the age-associated diseases as well as the aging process itself are controlled by environmental factor, by lifestyle factor, including nutrition and physical activity. The other concept is that while the age-associated diseases and aging process are separate, they are also very much related, and we can't talk about one without the other. So that also opens up the possibility of being able to change the course of healthy aging. So key in terms of developing strategies to promote healthy aging or successful aging is the ability to be able to define what is successful aging. But I can tell you that there is not very much consensus on definition of what is meant by successful aging, as you will see. So when we first started talking about successful aging around 1960s, pretty much successful aging was defined as lack of diseases, or it was focusing on the negative attributes. But today, we know that successful aging is not the opposite of lack of diseases, and there are many other factors in addition to being healthy that contribute to how we successfully age. The first people who talked about this concept of healthy aging that goes beyond just biological and health were Rowe and Kahn, where they defined healthy aging through their research with the MacArthur Research Network of Successful Agers. They defined aging not just to include lack of diseases, but also to have high cognitive ability, physical ability, as well as social functioning. And that was the first time that these other factors, these other domains, entered into the definition of successful aging. Later, in addition to the three domains that I already mentioned, which is the biological health, as well as cognitive health and physical functioning, they added this factor of resilience. And by resilience, that's the adaptability and the ability to deal with unforeseen and unpredicted situations. For example, death in the family, or if you're mobbed, or if you're robbed by a thief or something, the ability to be able to bounce back is very important in terms of how you would successfully age. And in doing that, using this definition, then they identified certain modifiable factors in terms of successful aging. And that included carbohydrate metabolism, osteoporosis, cognitive function, psychosocial factors. It went by itself. Psychosocial factors, as well as bereavement and relocation. Other institutions following that started to include this definition in how they describe successful aging. For example, NIA and the White House Conference on Aging and WHO all have emphasized that healthy aging goes beyond absence of disease and disability. Similarly, Center for Disease Control has also included these other factors in their definition. And finally, the Canadian government has actually gone a step beyond, and they have defined healthy aging as a lifelong process of optimizing opportunities for improving and preserving health and physical, social, and marital wellness, independence, quality of life, and enhancing successful life course transitions. So you can see that it becomes a more holistic definition than just focusing on health alone. Now, others have also come up with several different definitions, and the one that I actually like is the last one, which is basically that you live healthy until the time that you just drop dead. So, that's, I think, the best way of successfully aging is that you would not have any illness until the time that you leave this world. And that's what we're hoping to be achieving, and that's what the goal should be in terms of successful aging. Now, to just give you some examples of what are some of the factors that have been determined to be important in terms of successful aging, I'd like to review with you this study by Tyrovolas et al., where they evaluated successful aging together with the assessment of dietary habits in relation to healthcare facility use among elders that were living in the Mediterranean area. They had about 2,600 elderly people that were anywhere between the age of 65 and 100. And these individuals were from 21 communities within the Mediterranean area, both rural and urban areas. So they, in order to define successful aging, they broke it down into 3 different domains. One, having low probability of diseases and disability. Second was having high cognitive and physical capacity. And then the third one was active participation through social activities. And in order to define that, they came up with this multidimensional way of assessing, and for each of these domains, they had different scores. And as you can see, they eventually came up with a 10-score list of factors that they evaluated in terms of determining how someone would successfully age, and then what were the contributing factors to that, and what was the relationship of that successful aging to the use of healthcare. So what they found out was that higher score of successful aging was associated with less use of healthcare services. So for every 1/10 of a unit increase in the successful aging index, which was based on those 10 factors that I mentioned before, that was associated with about 0.8 less time a person used the healthcare services or sought consultation from physician. So that's pretty important. So it sort of indicates that this 10 index score was a good predictor of, at least in terms of successful aging, the use of healthcare services. What they found out that you can see in this table is that then they listed factors that were important in terms of contributing to this successful aging score. And anything that had a score of less than 0.3, they did not include in this table. And one thing that you can notice is that, first of all, the lifestyle characteristic as well as the clinical characteristics were very important in terms of contribution to successful aging. And in particular, 48% of the determinants of successful aging were those that we consider lifestyle factors. For example, the Mediterranean diet, you can see that the Mediterranean score diet was very important, as was frequency of daily physical activity. So this is, I think, one of the first studies that points to the importance of both nutrition and physical activity in terms of indexes that are used for successful aging. Deb and Juste wanted to determine what % of people in US were successfully aging. So in order to do that, they did a review of the literature of all the existing studies that were available in the literature, and then they categorized the component of the definition of successful aging into the variables that they could determine. And one of the things that they noticed was that there were many different ways that different studies had categorized or had defined successful aging. And as you'll see, that becomes a problem. So overall, they were able to identify 28 studies that had used 29 different definitions of successful aging. So you can see how we need to try to come up with one definition that everyone can use if we are to find consistency between the different ways that, or in determining what defines successful aging. So what they found was that shouldn't be of a surprise to you. What you see in this graph is the different studies that they reviewed in the literature, and this is % of people that they identified as successful agers. So what you would notice is that there is a huge variation on how in % of people that are defined as successful agers, depending on the type of a study and what definition is used. I mean, some studies based on the definition that you use have a very high percentage of successful agers, and others come up with a very low percentage of successful agers. What I also want you to note are these two darker bars. Those are the ones that older people themselves defined or determined their percentage of, how successfully they were aging. And you will notice that, as I will mention later, that those are among, when older people define themselves how successfully they're aging, they come up with a higher percentage of people who are aged successfully, and we'll get back to this in a minute. So what they found was that the source of variability in terms of percent of successful ages was, the one important factor was how the study, a particular study, had defined successful aging. And that the unsuccess, and another source of variation was who they use as the control group, or the group that was considered unsuccessful. So that contributed to the variability. And also that if there was a bias toward studying negative outcomes, that resulted in having a lower percentage of people being considered as successful agers. So, nevertheless, from this review of the literature, what they found was that there was a strong support for predicting successful aging when there was absence of arthritis, hearing problems, better activities of daily living, and not smoking. And there was moderate support for higher exercise and physical activity level, better self-rated health, lower systolic blood pressure, fewer medical conditions, global cognitive function, and absence of depression. And there was limited support for having a higher income, greater education, current marriage status, and white ethnicity. So I guess money doesn't always bring in successful aging. At least that's what these studies showed. So they concluded that prevention of disability and cognitive decline of our paramount interest in terms of successful aging, and studies in this review offer evidence that health-related practices, for example, smoking, exercise, chronic illness, example, diabetes and arthritis, and subjective health are more robust determinants of successful aging than our demographic or socioeconomic factors. One of the things that you'll notice is that they don't mention specifically nutrition, for example, in many of these studies, and I believe that is because they really did not use a very robust way of assessing nutritional status. Often the only thing that they use is weight or BMI, and they do not do a very good nutritional status. The only one that did that was a study in Mediterranean, and there you could see a very strong correlation between the Mediterranean diet and prediction of successful aging. And I think we'll get back to this later. So Pierre et al. Then looked at association between baseline behavioral risk factors and subsequent healthy aging in a cohort of people that were age 60 or over. They put together 8 studies from 341 papers that they looked at that had a follow-up of between anywhere from 2 to 60 years. They were mostly studies that were done in US, and they were all community older adults. And what they found was that the definition of healthy or successful aging ranged from primarily focusing on biological factors in these studies, for example, survival to old age with the absence of disability, to a very comprehensive assessment of successful aging that included well-being and psychosocial models. And what they found was that in these studies, they use less, despite the wide range of approaches that they used to define healthy aging, there were certain things that was included in all of them. For example, maintenance of functional independence was measured as the ability to perform basic and or instrumental activities of daily living, and less frequently in this definition they use high functioning in tests of physical performance, cognitive ability, and absence of diseases and psychiatric morbidity. So these indicators were used within the different domains of outcomes. And they were sort of aggregated into summary scores. And which aggregation they used and how they put in summary scores into aggregates was important in terms of determining the percent of healthy agers and in terms of determining how people were successfully aging. So again, you can see that the way that you would score and what goes into these aggregates that determines the different domains of healthy aging is very important. So some of the things that they found from this study was that the behavioral determinants associated with healthy aging were included normal weight, physical activity, not smoking, moderate alcohol, not being depressed, and more social contact. And we'll get back to this social contact. And again, you see that nutrition per se is not mentioned, although you can see that there are a lot of factors here that are related to nutrition. So what they said from this study or concluded from this review of this group of studies was that successful aging is a state wherein an individual is able to invoke adaptive, psychosocial, and social mechanisms to compensate for physiological limitations in life, and a sense of personal fulfillment, even in the context of illness and disability, to achieve a sense of well-being, high self-assessed quality of life. So they sort of talked about, again, three different domains that overlap with each other. The physiological domain that includes diseases and impairment, the sociological domain that includes engaging with the other people and in terms of spirituality, and then psychological domains in terms of emotional vitality. So this is actually a very interesting study because, and it might be a little complicated, but what they're looking at is the chronological age, 50 or 80, which is sort of start of the study, and then they followed the people up to when they were, for later. And what you're looking at is the cognitive function, and the black line is people who have limited social engagement, and the other two lines are average social engagement, and the very sort of dotted line is excessive social engagement. So what they're looking at is the relationship between social engagement, the number of social engagement, and your ability to preserve your cognitive function at two different age groups, 50 or 80. And what you can see is that, to begin with, people who have more social engagement have better cognitive function than those who have limited social engagement. And what you can see is that these people, in terms of decline, they don't decline as fast as they get older, but look at how quickly the people who have limited social engagement decline in terms of their cognitive function. So that tells you that how socially engaged an older person is very important in terms of their ability to maintain their cognitive function. So what they concluded from that is that being connected to social groups had the effect of reducing the cognitive age of an 80 years old by about 0.5 years. So that's very significant. And what they concluded was that we no longer question the significance of social engagement in terms of the ability to maintain cognitive function and other aspects of successful aging. What we need to define is how do we define the different components of social engagement? What are the components of social engagement that contribute in terms of successful aging? Is it the ability of having, for example, lunches together? Are there other aspects of social engagement that is important? So, objective definition of successful aging that are based on physical health emphasize outcomes that includes freedom from disability and diseases. Subjective definitions really center on well-being, social connectedness, and adaptation. So there are two ways of looking at successful aging. Either you use objective definitions and then subjective definitions. And early on, we were only focusing on objective definitions, but now we are realizing that we need to include both objective and subjective definitions. And most older people, if you look at them, they would not meet the criteria of objective definition of successful aging, but many would meet the criteria of successful aging if you include subjective measures of successful aging. And you can see that based on, and this is very well illustrated here, because if you go by absence of diseases, only 15% of older people will be considered successfully aging. But if you go by other measures that include subjective measures of aging, you can see life satisfaction, for example, or independent living, a much larger proportion of older people will meet this criteria. One of the points that was very interesting as I was looking at this is that there's really a gulf between researchers and lay definition of successful aging. The older people define successful aging more based on subjective criteria, whereas physicians and researchers define successful aging more based on absence of diseases and biological health. And this is very well demonstrated here because when they looked at self-rated successful aging in older adults, you can see that majority of older adults rated themselves as successfully aging. And the older adults' view of successful aging is not really the same as that of the health professionals. So Montrose et al. Investigated the criteria and correlates of subjectively rated successful aging and found that 92% of community-dwelling older adults viewed themselves as aging successfully despite having some chronic and physical illness and some disability. And these are some of the components that they considered as important in terms of determining their measure of how successfully they were aging. Things like sense of purpose, dignity, being engaged in the community, spirituality, and being involved with the neighborhood. Those were very important factors for the older adults. And as you can see, not only it's important for older adults, but it does impact on their cognitive function and other abilities as well. So longitudinal studies of reliability and validity of subjective measures of successful aging are needed before we can really come up with a good definition of how we define successful aging. And that's something that is very much lacking from the literature. We understand now that these subjective measures are important, but we don't have very good ways of quantifying these subjective measures. So to conclude, over the last 50 years, the definition of successful aging has really evolved from one that was focused on biological factors, health factors, disabilities, and more sort of negative outcomes, to one today that includes psychosocial domains that are more subjective and reflect well-being from the point of view of the older adults themselves. And while there is overlap among the different definition of healthy or successful aging proposed to date, there is also debate on which component of successful aging are key in terms of determining successful aging, and who should really be defining this, the criteria for successful aging. Should it be the health professionals and the physicians and the researchers, or should it be the older adults themselves, or both of them together? So regardless of that, though, there are certain components that have come across as being important in many of the studies, and that include physical, cognitive, and social functioning and engagement seems to be a common thread that runs through many of the definitions that different people have used. And while there is good consensus as to how to assess physical and cognitive health, it is more difficult to objectively define social function and engagement, as I mentioned before. And what we need in order to close this gap is to have a close collaboration between the biological scientists and social scientists. And that collaboration should include the older adults themselves, because we can't go on and define what successful aging is by ourselves without getting input from the older adults themselves. And we need to have more research to better define early determinants and risk factors for key components of successful aging, particularly of nutrition, because as I mentioned, while as you can see in the next slide, nutrition-related factors are defined as being important for determining successful aging, nutrition by itself does not come come across as an important determining factor in many of the studies that I reviewed, and I think that is because those studies have not really used good assessment of nutritional factors. So, for example, you can see in this graph, although I think the top part of it has been cut off, but many of the factors that are mentioned as in red that are important in terms of successful aging, and if you could look up there, you can see obesity, for example, you can see high blood pressure. These are all factors that are related to nutrition, but in the studies themselves, they won't mention nutrition. And also secondary factors, for example, blood glucose and so forth are among the factors that are related to nutrition and very important in terms of across many different studies in terms of determining successful aging. I apologize for this. I think when I checked it, it looked okay, but the upper half seems to be cut off. So I want to stop by just showing you the picture of my parents who actually successfully aged. My father lived to be 98 years old, and he was very healthy until the last month of his life. So I think that he really, that's the way I would like to age. And my mother, who is still alive, is 94 years old, and they both really do a lot of the things that we have come up after many years and through research, and we recommend. I think they did it by instinct, and it really helped them to be successfully aging. Thank you very much.